Ethan told me he wanted an open marriage on the same night our restaurant made the cover of the city's biggest food magazine, standing in our kitchen, still wearing the chef's coat with his own name embroidered on the pocket. A bottle of champagne he hadn't offered to share with me sitting open on the counter between us. My name is Chen. I was 31 years old, and for 6 years I had been married to a man whose name was on every article, every award, every gleaming brass plaque bolted to the exterior of a restaurant that existed, in large part, because I had spent 2 years of my life building it with him from a folding table in our old apartment. Ethan Hale, he'd kept his mother's maiden name for the business, said it photographed better than Chen Hale on a menu, was, by any public measure, a rising star. 34 years old, classically trained, the kind of chef who got profiled for his instinct and his fearlessness in the kitchen. What almost nobody outside our four walls knew was that the restaurant itself, the concept, the branding, the investor deck that got us our first loan, the social media presence that turned a 28-seat dining room into a 9-month wait list, had come almost entirely out of my head. I'd left a stable marketing director job to help him open Ferris 3 years earlier, not because I wanted to be a restaurateur, but because I believed in him, and because at the time, believing in someone you loved and building something together felt like the most natural decision in the world. I remember the exact conversation where I made that decision, sitting on the floor of our first apartment, spreadsheets spread out around us, Ethan sketching menu concepts on the back of a takeout receipt because we couldn't afford proper notebooks yet. Both of us laughing about how absurd it was that we thought we could actually pull this off. I gave notice at my job 2 weeks later, cashed out most of my modest savings to cover our first 3 months of rent while we chased investors, and never once looked back, because for those early years, it didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt like the beginning of a life we were building with both hands. I wrote the opening press release myself, from our kitchen table, at 2 in the morning, 6 months pregnant with an idea instead of a child, because we'd agreed early on that a baby would have to wait until the restaurant found its feet. I built the entire social media presence from zero, personally photographed every dish for the first year until we could afford a real photographer, personally answered every reservation email, every press inquiry, every collaboration request. I learned, largely by trial and error, how to negotiate a commercial lease, how to read a profit and loss statement, how to talk a skeptical bank loan officer into believing in 2 people with no restaurant experience and a folding table full of ambition. Ethan cooked. I did, quite literally, everything else, and for the first 2 years, I never once resented it, because it felt like our project, our risk, our future. Somewhere around year 3, right around the time the magazine profile started, right around the time investors started calling him directly instead of routing everything through the business email, I managed the story of Ferris quietly stopped being about us and started being about him. I noticed it in small ways first. A journalist would ask, in an interview I'd personally arranged, how he developed his singular vision for the restaurant, and he'd answer at length without once mentioning that the restaurant's actual concept had been my idea, born out of a conversation about the neighborhood we lived in and what it was missing. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the credit wasn't the point, that building something together was the point, and that eventually, the record would correct itself. The cover story is where things actually started to unravel. Stay with me, because the next several months revealed exactly how little I'd actually mattered to the story he was telling about himself. The magazine profile ran 2 weeks after the shoot, 8 glossy pages with Ethan photographed alone in the kitchen, tasting spoon in hand, moody lighting, the whole production. I wasn't in a single photograph, despite having personally coordinated the entire shoot, negotiated the photographer's rate down by 30%, and spent an entire Sunday steaming the chef's coat he wore for the cover. The article quoted him extensively on his solo journey, from culinary school dropout to restaurant owner, on the sacrifices he'd made alone to get here. My name appeared exactly once, in a single sentence describing me as his supportive wife, a phrase that landed in my chest like something physical. I didn't say anything to him about the article that night. I told myself I was being oversensitive, that a magazine profile wasn't obligated to mention the general manager's contributions, even if that general manager happened to also be his wife and the person who'd built the entire operational and marketing infrastructure the restaurant ran on. I poured myself a glass of the champagne he hadn't offered, sat at our kitchen table, and read the article twice more, looking for my own name like it might have appeared on a second read if I just looked hard enough. I called my older sister the next morning, mostly just to vent, expecting her to tell me I was overreacting the way I'd half convinced myself I was. She didn't. She'd read the article too, had actually texted me a screenshot of the supportive wife line before I'd even finished my coffee, and she asked me carefully how long I thought I could keep doing invisible work for someone else's visible career before it started costing me something I couldn't easily get back. I didn't have a good answer for her that morning. I do now. That was the night he told me he'd been thinking, lately, about growth. About how the last 6 years had happened so fast, how we'd gone from dating to married to business partners without ever really pausing to ask ourselves what we each individually wanted out of life. He said the words carefully, in the tone he used when he'd clearly rehearsed something in his head before saying it out loud, and told me he thought we should consider opening the marriage, not because he didn't love me, he said, but because he felt like he'd never gotten to explore who he was outside of us, outside of the restaurant, outside of the identity we'd built together before he'd even had the chance to figure out who he was on his own. I sat very still and let him finish. I asked him, once he'd stopped talking, whether this had anything to do with a 26-year-old sommelier named Brielle who'd joined the restaurant 8 months earlier and who I'd noticed, in the way you notice things you'd rather not, lingered a beat too long in the kitchen after service more nights than not. He didn't deny it outright. He said it wasn't about her specifically, that he'd just realized, working alongside someone new, someone who saw only the confident, celebrated version of him the magazines wrote about, that he missed the feeling of being seen as exciting instead of familiar. He said it like it was a diagnosis rather than a confession, like he was explaining a medical condition rather than telling me he wanted permission to be with other people while I continued running the business that made his celebrated life possible. If you have been listening for a while, drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button while you're at it, and be sure you're subscribed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of him, not that night. I told him I needed time to think, went into our bedroom, closed the door quietly, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time doing something that surprised even me, not falling apart, but calculating. I thought about the operating agreement for the restaurant, which I drafted myself, and which listed me as a 40% owner despite my name never once appearing in a magazine. I thought about the vendor contracts, all negotiated under my name because Ethan had never had the patience for the paperwork side of the business. I thought about the social media accounts, the reservation system, the press contact list, the loyalty program I'd built that accounted for nearly a third of our weekly covers, every piece of infrastructure that made Ferris function, quietly sitting under my direct control, invisible in every magazine profile, but structurally load-bearing in every single sense that actually mattered. I didn't confront him again that week. I didn't rage, didn't threaten, didn't give him the dramatic ultimatum he might have half expected, the kind that would let him play the reasonable, patient partner while I played the emotional wife unable to handle an honest conversation about growth. Instead, I did something quieter, and in hindsight, far more effective. I started building an exit, piece by piece, without telling him a single detail of what I was doing. I spent that first week simply observing, almost clinically, exactly how much of the restaurant's daily operation ran through channels only I had access to. I made a private list, late at night after Ethan had gone to sleep, of every vendor relationship, every media contact, every recurring operational task that existed nowhere in writing except inside my own head. The list ran to 4 pages by the end of the week, and reading it back, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself admit before, that I wasn't simply his wife who happened to help out. I was, in every functional sense that mattered, the actual operational backbone of a business that had spent 3 years building a public identity around someone else entirely. I'd been quietly freelancing marketing consulting work on the side for the last year, mostly for other restaurants in the city who'd seen what I'd built for Ferris and wanted something similar for themselves. I'd always turned most of it down out of loyalty, keeping Ferris as my full focus. In the 3 weeks after Ethan's announcement, I said yes to every single inquiry sitting in my inbox. I registered a business name, Chen Hospitality Group, deliberately using the name he'd once told me didn't photograph as well as his, and began quietly building a client roster of 5 restaurants across the city, each of them paying me directly for exactly the kind of work I'd been doing for Ferris for 3 years for nothing but a salary that hadn't been adjusted since our 2nd year in business. I also, carefully and without any dramatic announcement, began stepping back from the parts of Ferris' operation that Ethan had simply assumed would always be handled without his involvement. I stopped personally responding to press inquiries after hours, letting them sit until normal business hours instead of the instant, always on responsiveness I'd built the restaurant's media reputation on. I stopped coordinating the increasingly frequent collaboration dinners and pop-up events that had become one of Ferris' biggest sources of press attention, quietly informing the events coordinator that scheduling now needed sign-off directly from Ethan, since he was, after all, the face of the restaurant. I stopped covering the gaps in the reservation system on weekends, the small fixes and adjustments I used to make instinctively, without anyone ever noticing there had been a problem at all. None of it was sabotage. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy, in that position, to let bitterness turn into something actively destructive, and I refused to become someone who burned down 6 years of genuine work out of spite. I simply stopped doing the invisible labor that had never once been acknowledged, and let the actual, structural gaps that labor had been quietly filling become visible for the first time. There's a specific, quiet discipline to that kind of restraint that I don't think people fully appreciate until they've had to practice it. The discomfort of watching something falter that you could, with one phone call, easily fix and choosing, deliberately, not to make that call. They became visible faster than either of us expected. Within a month, a scheduling error left 2 private events double-booked on the same Saturday night, something that had never once happened in 3 years because I had always personally cross-checked the calendar before confirming any private booking. Ethan handled the fallout badly, publicly frustrated in front of staff in a way he'd never had to be before, because he'd never previously had to handle a crisis like that without me quietly fixing it in the background before it became his problem. A journalist who'd previously received same-day responses to interview requests started publishing pieces with noticeably less access, noticeably shorter quotes. Because the relationship I'd spent years cultivating with the local food press had never actually belonged to Ethan, it had belonged to me, and I was no longer picking up the phone at 9 at night to make sure a deadline got met. He asked me, about 5 weeks in, if something was wrong. I told him, honestly, that nothing was wrong at all, that I was simply doing exactly what he'd asked for, giving both of us the space to figure out who we were outside the identity we'd built together. He didn't have a response to that. I don't think he'd ever actually considered that open marriage might mean anything beyond permission for him. I don't think it occurred to him, until that exact conversation, that it might also mean I stopped filling in every gap his own limitations created, simply because I no longer felt obligated to hold up a structure that had stopped crediting me for holding it up in the first place. Around that same time, my sister asked if I wanted to get lunch, and I found myself, for the first time in years, genuinely excited to talk about something other than the restaurant. I told her about the first client who'd signed with Chen Hospitality Group, a small Italian place 2 neighborhoods over whose owner had cried a little when I showed her the projected increase in weekend covers after just 1 month of proper marketing. My sister asked, gently, whether I'd noticed I sounded happier talking about a restaurant I didn't own than I had in months talking about the one I did. I hadn't noticed, not consciously, but she wasn't wrong. The turning point came 2 months later, at an investor dinner Ethan had scheduled without me, deliberately, I later learned, because Brielle had suggested it might be more relaxed, without the general manager present to steer every conversation toward operations. The dinner was meant to secure funding for a second location, something Ethan had been chasing for the better part of a year, convinced that Ferris' reputation alone would carry the pitch. What he didn't fully understand What he genuinely never had to understand, because I had always quietly handled it, was that the investor group in question had specifically asked, in an email I still had access to as the registered contact, for detailed financial projections and a growth strategy document before committing to a second meeting. That email had been sitting in the shared business inbox for 11 days. Nobody had responded to it, because responding to exactly that kind of correspondence had always, without exception, been my job. The dinner, from what I heard afterward through a mutual friend who'd also been there, went badly. Ethan spoke passionately about vision and instinct and creative growth, the same language that photographed beautifully in magazine profiles, and the investors, polite but visibly unimpressed, asked pointed questions about unit economics and staffing models that he simply didn't have prepared answers for, because those numbers had always lived in spreadsheets I maintained, spreadsheets he'd never once needed to open himself. My friend told me, almost apologetically, that Ethan had tried to bluff his way through a question about projected labor costs for the second location, offering a rough estimate that was off by nearly 40% from the actual figures sitting untouched in that 11-day-old email. The lead investor, apparently, went quiet in a way that told everyone in the room exactly how the meeting was going to end. The group left without committing to anything. The second location, as far as I know, never happened. He came home that night looking genuinely rattled for the first time since this whole thing started, the confident, magazine cover version of himself replaced by something closer to the person I'd actually fallen in love with 6 years earlier, before success had given him room to forget how much of it he'd never built alone. He asked me, directly this time, if I would help him prepare the projections properly, get another meeting scheduled, fix what had gone wrong at the dinner. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't, in the end, say no outright, but I also didn't drop everything the way I once would have, the way I'd trained him, without either of us fully realizing it, to expect I always would. If you have been listening for a while, drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button while you're at it, and be sure you're subscribed. Over the following month, the pattern kept repeating in smaller ways, each one chipping quietly at the version of himself he'd built his public identity around. A supplier dispute that would have taken me one calm phone call to resolve dragged on for 2 weeks and nearly cost us our produce contract, because Ethan didn't have the relationship with the vendor that I'd spent years building. A negative review, the kind I would have normally flagged and helped him craft a graceful public response to within the hour, sat unanswered for 4 days and picked up traction on social media before he even noticed it existed. Small things. Individually forgettable. Together, they amounted to the slow, undeniable discovery that the restaurant's success had never actually been a solo act, no matter how convincingly the magazine profiles had made it look like one. A regular customer, someone who'd been coming to Ferris nearly every week since we opened, mentioned to a server one evening that the place just felt different lately, nothing dramatic, no single obvious failure. Just 100 small warmths that had quietly disappeared along with the person who used to personally remember birthdays, personally seat regulars at their favorite tables, personally follow up after a bad night to make sure they'd come back. The server relayed the comment to Ethan, thinking nothing of it. He mentioned it to me almost in passing, and I watched something shift in his face as he said it, the first flicker of understanding that whatever had made the restaurant feel the way it felt hadn't been entirely about the food on the plate. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters more than the satisfaction of watching things unravel. I didn't feel triumphant watching any of this happen. I felt, mostly, a strange kind of grief for the version of our marriage I genuinely believed in, for the 2 years I'd spent building something I'd thought was ours, for the 6 years of loving a person who, it turned out, had needed me to be invisible in order to feel like the story about himself made sense. There were nights during those 4 months when I cried harder over the loss of the partnership I'd imagined we had than I ever did over the actual open marriage request itself, because grieving an illusion, I learned, takes far longer than grieving a single betrayal. Brielle left the restaurant about 10 weeks after the investor dinner, taking a position at a competing wine bar across town. I never found out the full details of what happened between them, and, honestly, by that point, I'd stopped particularly caring. Whatever excitement Ethan had been chasing when he asked for an open marriage seemed to have evaporated somewhere between the double-booked events and the failed funding pitch, replaced by a much less glamorous reality. The reality of a business quietly falling apart at exactly the seams he'd never known existed, because he'd never had to look for them before. I heard, through the same mutual friend who'd been at the investor dinner, that he'd started staying at the restaurant later and later into the night, not cooking, just sitting alone in the empty dining room after close, running numbers by hand on a legal pad because he still hadn't figured out how to properly use the spreadsheets I'd left behind. He asked to talk, properly, about 4 months after that night in the kitchen with the champagne he hadn't offered to share. He said he understood now, more clearly than he had at the time, what he'd actually been asking me to give up when he asked for that freedom. He said the last few months had shown him, in ways he hadn't expected, exactly how much of what people called his success had quietly depended on partnership he'd stopped treating as equal. He apologized, and I believe the apology was genuine, in the way people are genuinely sorry once consequences finally catch up to decisions they'd assumed were free. He asked, toward the end of that conversation, if there was any version of this where we tried again, not the open marriage. He clarified quickly, but the marriage itself, rebuilt on different terms this time, terms where my name actually appeared somewhere. I sat with the question longer than I expected to, because some old, tired part of me still wanted to say yes, still wanted to believe the version of him sitting across from me now, chastened and finally paying attention, was the version I'd get to keep. But I'd learned something in those 4 months that I wasn't willing to unlearn just because he'd finally noticed what he'd lost. I'd learned what it felt like to build something with only my own name on it, and I wasn't willing to trade that feeling for a second chance at being essential and uncredited all over again, no matter how sincerely he meant the apology. I told him I appreciated the honesty, and I meant it. But I also told him something I'd spent 4 months coming to understand about myself in the process, that I no longer needed the marriage, or the restaurant, or the identity of being the invisible hand behind someone else's celebrated life, the way I once had. Chen Hospitality Group had grown, in those 4 months, into something with its own momentum entirely separate from Ferris, 11 client restaurants now, a small team of 3 people working under me, a reputation built entirely under my own name for the first time in 6 years. I had discovered, somewhere in the space he'd asked me to give him, that I didn't actually need him to see me in order for me to be someone worth seeing. He looked, hearing that, like a man realizing the ground he'd assumed would always be there had quietly finished shifting some time ago without his noticing. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me otherwise. I think, by that point, some part of him had already understood, watching Chen Hospitality Group grow from the sidelines over those 4 months, that whatever he was hoping to win back no longer existed in the same form he remembered leaving it in. We finalized the divorce 8 months after that dinner. I kept my 40% stake in Ferris as part of the settlement, structured as a silent ownership position, a quiet irony neither of us commented on directly, though I think we both understood exactly what it meant. The restaurant is still open. It's doing fine, from what I hear, though the second location never materialized, and the magazine profiles have grown noticeably quieter in the 2 years since. I run Chen Hospitality Group full-time now, out of an office with my own name on the lease, working with restaurant owners across the city who, unlike Ethan, actually want to understand the mechanics behind their own success rather than simply enjoy the polish of it. Last month, one of my newer clients asked, almost offhandedly, whether I'd ever considered opening my own place instead of just consulting for other people's. I laughed, told her I'd already spent 3 years building someone else's restaurant from the ground up and learned everything I needed to learn from that particular chapter. Maybe someday. For now, I like the work of helping other people avoid the exact mistake I lived through, the mistake of building something remarkable and then quietly forgetting, or letting someone else forget, who actually built it. I still think, sometimes, about that magazine cover, Ethan alone in the kitchen, tasting spoon in hand, moody lighting, the supportive wife mentioned once in 8 glossy pages. and about how long it took me to understand that being essential and being credited are two entirely different things, and that a person can spend years building someone else's story before finally realizing they're allowed to build their own instead. I don't know if Ethan ever fully understood what he actually asked for that night in the kitchen. I don't think he understood, standing there in his chef's coat with his name stitched onto the pocket, that asking me for space to grow meant, structurally and inevitably, asking me to stop filling every gap his own limitations created, and that once I stopped, the whole careful architecture of his celebrated, solo success would finally reveal exactly how much of it had never been solo at all. Sometimes, when a new client asks me why I left the restaurant industry's most talked about kitchen to start over under my own name, I tell them the honest version instead of the polished one, that I didn't leave because I stopped loving the work. I left because I finally understood the difference between being needed and being seen, and once I'd tasted what it felt like to be both at the same time, I was never going to settle for only the first one again. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. Thank you for being a part of Love Behind Mind.